Indian films have been exported and circulating the globe since the first feature film was made in 1913. And in the first half of the century, East Africa was the most lucrative market for Indian films in the world. Zanzibar, Tanganyika, and Kenya, I would assert, are where Bollywood first learned to go global. In 1960, Indian films earned 3,320,000 rupees in East Africa. Earnings in Malaysia were close behind, but those in West Africa, Canada, or the UK were less than 10% of their East African trade. For much of the 20th century, going to the movies on Sunday to see the latest Indian release was the most common form of entertainment in cities and towns across Tanzania. These films were so popular and demand for tickets so intense that for 40 years there was a vibrant black market in cinema tickets on Sundays. I talked to numerous men who earned their sole means of livelihood, building homes, feeding families, raising children, just on money that they earned from selling black market cinema tickets. South Asian immigrants to East Africa were at the core of the cinema industry, but Africans were the bulk of the clientele. So by 1904, if not before, exhibitions of moving pictures were a regular feature of nightlife in Zanzibar town. Hassan Ali Adamji Jariwala, who was barely 20 years old, was the pioneer of the industry in East Africa. Jariwala was actually a cloth merchant who traveled by dhow on the monsoon winds, bringing goods from Bombay to Madagascar and Zanzibar. According to his grandson, one year somebody gave him some films to take along, and when he would stop in a port, he would put on itinerant shows just for fun. In 1914, he settled permanently in Zanzibar, choosing to make it his new home. That same year, he opened the region's first semi-permanent exhibition hall inside a khaki tent adjacent to the Central Market. He named the theater the Alexandra, and the official Gazette proudly advertised that the latest releases from India, Europe, and the United States were seen each night. By 1916, he had 2 venues like this in Zanzibar and a 3rd in Dar es Salaam. He received his prints, he bought his prints secondhand from others who had similar venues in India. In the 1910s, he was showing about 14 different films every week, changing his program every Wednesday and Saturday. As other proprietors moved into the industry and started showing films as well in East Africa, he would pass his prints along to them. And through the 1930s, he was the principal supplier of films throughout the region. This map illustrates several important features of this trade. For one, it shows how the cinema industry followed earlier trade routes and patterns from the pre-colonial caravan trades. As was the case with 19th century trade, Zanzibar served as the main entrepot for commercial goods entering and leaving the region, as well as the main center of finance and credit. Films and projectors supplied by Jariwala moved either from Zanzibar to Dar es Salaam and then to Tabora and Ujiji through the center, or from Zanzibar to Pemba and then across to Tanga, up to Moshi, Arusha, and Mwanza. India was the source of films and equipment, and South Asian immigrants to East Africa, the agents of the spread of ideas about aesthetics in film. During World War I, Jariwala's cloth trade flourished, and by the end of the war, so in just 6 years, he had amassed enough capital to begin the construction of East Africa's first picture palace, pictured here, which was built in Zanzibar and opened in 1921. In the 1930s, as Jariwala aged, he tutored others who shared his passion for film, helping them to open theaters, establish links to producers in India, and expand networks for supplying films across Tanganyika, Kenya, and Uganda. Mohanlal Kalasivani, on the right, based in Mombasa, was one of these men. Like Jariwala, he came from Gujarat. He arrived in Mombasa in 1918, a teenager again with just a few pennies in his pocket. Like legions of others, he was deemed trustworthy by somebody with capital in Bombay and employed as an East African agent, receiving imports of flour and dry goods from India and forwarding them along to others in East Africa. By 1925, he had amassed enough capital to start trading on his own, and he switched from foodstuffs to cloth as well. He gradually began bringing in movies, a few at a time, but he didn't have a theater. So he would show them by showing them on a blank wall inside a storage shed, and then giving them to people like Jariwala, who had theaters that he also supplied with cloth. In 1935, he forged a partnership with Jariwala and Jariwala's other partner in Zanzibar, Jariwala's partner built this theater here called the Majestic in Zanzibar. One was a Shia Muslim, the other one a Lohana Hindu, but that made no difference in terms of their personal connections or their interest in film. Savani, based in Mombasa, grew in the 1950s and 60s to become a key link in a family chain distributing Indian films throughout the world. Another man that helped, that Jariwala helped into the industry was Shavak Shah Talati, who's on the left here. In 1932, when Jariwala introduced sound to the Royal Theatre, Talati purchased his silent cinema from him in Zanzibar. 7 years later, Talati and other partners from Zanzibar opened another palace known as the Empire, followed by a third, the Sultana, pictured here. This group, known as Indo-African, became the main rivals of Savani and the Majestic Group, importing films into the region. In the 1940s and 50s, the cinema exhibition industry in Tanzania exploded until nearly every town in Tanzania had at least one cinema, and many boasted several. The downtowns and urban centers of East Africa exploded in the late 1940s and 50s as East African Asians invested their liquid cash into solid property. They built all kinds of things, but cinemas were some of those that were built in Tanzania. In the country, 40 cinemas by the time of independence in Tanzania. Most other places, Kenya only had 20, Uganda 14, the Rhodesias, 14 between them, 4 in Malawi. But part of it has to do, again, with these Indian Ocean connections. That most of the rest of the continent, the first theaters and the major suppliers of films, came out of South Africa. They were built into networks of monopoly control and monopoly capital out of South Africa, and they really determined how the industry developed. Tanzania took a different tact. It was a whole bunch of very small-scale, independent entrepreneurs who built the theaters and who ran distribution. So those 3 I mentioned were the 3 big ones, but there were plenty of others as well. So my argument is that it was this, the plethora of small-scale entrepreneurs really allowed the industry to thrive in a way that it didn't elsewhere. This also impacted the kinds of films that were shown. So Tanzanians had a much wider range of films that they were allowed to see than people pretty much anywhere else in the world, because they had connections not just to India, but also to Egypt, later on to Southeast Asia, and to continental Europe. The main supplier out of South Africa not only monopolized distribution and what was shown in South Africa, he actually managed to get a contract that granted him monopoly rights to distribute for major Hollywood and British producers everywhere south of the equator, and he continuously pushed that through the time of independence to claim all of Africa south of the Sahara. The power of East African distributors and the local market that gave them access to the best films being produced in India. the hottest films were always shown on East African screens.